And that's part of what makes this problem so tricky in reducing our emissions, that there's so many sectors of our activity, of our lives, that are touched by this. Now, of course, there are technologies that are out there that in some instances are even on the shelf that we could use to try and substitute. But at the same time, if you look at the numbers, the penetration, the rates of adoption, it's still early days with most of these technologies. So for instance, electric cars. You hear a lot about them, you see them more and more on the road, but they're still a pretty small fraction of our fleet nationally. Or renewable energy. So I think we're seeing more and more of this, especially in the Midwest. I think you're seeing more and more wind turbines, solar farms. The growth has been enormous, and it's been a manifold growth over the past 10, 20 years, but wind and solar is still only 14% of our production nationally. These numbers are a bit higher in Nebraska, even higher than that in neighboring Iowa, but again, nationally, still relatively small. We're growing. For industrial heat, one idea is to use hydrogen, to burn hydrogen the same way that like rocket fuel is made of hydrogen. So when you watch a rocket blast off, that's the fuel in those big rocket boosters. And the hope is to make this hydrogen from renewable energy and then send it over to industrial sites where they'll burn it. But this idea is still in its infancy, and adoption is very, very small. For agriculture, there are alternative fertilizers we could use. There's plant-based meat, but again, in the case of plant-based meat, adoption rates are very low. And for buildings, how many people have heard of this idea of electrify everything? Has anyone heard of that? Okay, a few folks. Yeah, okay, more than a few. So that's just the idea that the appliances in your home, many of which might be gas-powered, that when they reach their end of life, after maybe a decade or so, you simply replace them with their electric alternative, like an induction stove or a heat pump to replace your furnace. And there's a case to be made for this. There were even subsidies for this in the Inflation Reduction Act from a few years ago. But again, penetration of these technologies today is still relatively small. And so this pie is so enormous, there's so many technologies involved here. Making this transition, if we choose to do it, will be an enormous expenditure of time and energy and money. And that's time, energy, money that we're not spending on other issues, on any of the myriad other concerns that we as a society have. So science can't tell us what to do about this, right? How we choose to spend our time and money and energy is going to be a function certainly of the science, but also of our values and our priorities and what we care about and what we as a community collectively decide is important to us. And just to underscore that, I want to zoom out to consider some pretty big picture questions having to do with our climate that I think we're all going to be grappling with as a nation and as a planet in the years to come. So here's one. Should developing nations, my parents are from Pakistan. That's a country whose energy emissions are dwarfed by the US and China and the other countries that we looked at. Should countries like that, should they develop on fossil fuels the way we did, cheap and easy? Or should they be expected to develop on renewable energy, which no country really has yet? That's a vigorous debate. It's happening on the international stage. There's books in the bookstores that you can read about this. What about our own efforts to combat climate change? Should we focus on adapting to the climate change that's already here, like folks in Venice, Italy did when they built this seawall to stem the rising tides of global warming? Or should we focus on mitigating future global warming by trying to reduce our emissions? And if that was our priority, then we'd probably be investing even more in renewable energy. Let's say we chose to mitigate and reduce our emissions as much as possible. What kind of policies would we want to put in place for that? Would we want policies that put restrictions on our activity or disincentivize things, fuel standards or carbon taxes? Or do we want policies that are more carrots than sticks and that provided subsidies and incentives, like the incentives I mentioned in the Inflation Reduction Act? And finally, should we consider geoengineering the planet? Has anyone heard that phrase, geoengineering? Yeah, I think a number of you, maybe about a third of you. So geoengineering is deliberately intervening in the climate system to try and offset global warming. And some of these ideas, most of them are pretty fantastical. One idea is to spray reflective particles into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight and cool the earth and basically mimic what happens after a volcanic eruption, like Andrew talked about. Another idea is to just suck carbon dioxide directly out of the air using huge banks of fans which blow air over chemical baths which absorb CO2. There's actually a pilot plant for this running right now in Iceland. And so it sounds like science fiction, but there's serious conversations about this happening in government and in universities and in research labs like the one where I work. So where does this leave us? We've got these huge issues. They're so thorny. The science itself is so complicated, as you saw in the landscape. There kind of aren't that many easy answers. And then when it comes to what we do about it, it gets even more complicated. And so our hope with this presentation is that as you go back out into the world, into your homes, your workplaces, and your communities, you'll take with you not only a sharpened sense of the science, what it can tell you, and what it can't tell you, but also a sense of how thorny these questions are, and how diverse the perspectives are. And so when you're discussing these issues with your family, with your friends, with your neighbors, hopefully you can bring an open-mindedness to their points of view, how it might interact with your points of view, and be able to engage with people with whom you agree and with whom you don't. And so we'll leave it there. We've got a few more events tomorrow in Omaha. If you know folks out there who might be interested in this, please pass the word.